So I'm going to talk to you about nutrients in vertical farms, hydroponics, and common traditional agriculture. And we'll talk about some of the differences and things that happen in them. So a bit of content. I'm going to cover fertilizer use in conventional agriculture, how fertilizers are used in hydroponic systems, and how we can understand what the differences are and what's happening with the nutrient solutions. We're going to look at the dynamics in these systems and how they change over time and what effects that can have. We're going to look into monitoring and how you'd be able to do that for your farm or your research. We're going to look at customizing nutrient solutions to help prevent imbalances and improve nutrient efficiencies. And then we're going to look at some improvements we can make just to make the whole system more efficient. So as a brief introduction, I'm sure you've all seen this slide or something similar to it before. The global population is going to increase to about 9 billion by 2050. So we've got to massively increase our agricultural output with various constraints that are put upon us, mainly soil erosion, water scarcity, climate change, all these big issues. So on the top graph, you can see sort of the gap between where we are and where we need to be, with the red line being sort of the output and the growth and productivity we need to feed all these people by 2050, and then the green line being where we currently are with our current output. So a nice little snippet and saying I've heard to do with this is we need to produce more food in the next 4 decades than all farmers in history have harvested in the past 8,000 years. And I think that really contextualizes the problem. The way we currently feed most people is through our dependence and use of synthetic fertilizers. So they're absolutely vital for our food security. They allow us to grow more, they allow us the yields to be larger, they allow us to grow quicker. They're just pretty fantastic. So you can see on this graph on the bottom, the grey portion is what the human population would look like with the food we could grow if we didn't have synthetic fertilizers. And then you can see in red the massive difference they make, allowing more people to live on Earth. And that's roughly 47% of the world's population is currently fed because we have these synthetic fertilizers. So I'll talk briefly about them and how they're used currently in conventional agriculture. So nitrogen is a big one, main component of most fertilizers. It's incredibly energy intensive to produce. So it's produced using the Haber process, which is where nitrogen is pulled from the air and produces ammonium, usually ammonium nitrate that we use spread on fields. It roughly uses 1 to 2% of the entire global energy supply, and this is usually in the form of 3 to 5% of all the natural gas we produce every year is used in this process, so it's massively energy intensive. Despite it being quite expensive to make in terms of our energy and output, we massively overuse it, and a lot of it's wasted. So you can see in the top graph, this is sort of the nitrogen balance for the UK. Light green bars on the top are the amount of nutrients nitrogen we've been applying to fields. The dark green bars on the bottom are the amount of nitrogen we're getting off the fields in the form of plant material. This averages out to that blue line, and anything above that blue line is sort of waste nitrogen that's either denitrifies into a gas and goes into the air, or is lost to the environment another way. And that's roughly about 50% of the nitrogen we have to fields is lost. It's quite inefficient. It's getting better over time. We're wasting less nitrogen than we used to, but it's still a big problem in conventional agriculture. So 50% of it doesn't go into the plant material and goes off into the field. So where does it go? It usually goes into groundwater and contaminates them. So if you look at the bottom image, that's the nitrate vulnerable zones. So zones in the UK are really vulnerable to nitrate leaching out of agricultural land and damaging local ecosystems. So high nitrate content in these areas sort of damage a lot of meadow species, natural woodlands. And once it gets into the groundwater and runs off into lakes, rivers and oceans, you have eutrophication and damaging local environments and causing big issues. Another important component of fertilizer in agriculture is phosphorus. It's one of the main 3, so nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. I'm just going to cover nitrogen and phosphorus in this one. The most important thing is it's a non-renewable resource. It's mainly found in rock in the ground that is mined, processed, and then shipped around the world. It uses a lot of fossil fuels in mining and processing it. And once it's used and washed out into rivers and oceans, it stays in the oceans for hundreds of years. It's usually only in the solid form or in organic matter. There's no gas phase where we can pull it from like we can with nitrogen, and it's lost. So it's in limited supply. So you can see on the graph on the top, the dark red at the bottom is all the phosphate that was in the rocks that we use and mine. And then the black line at the top is how much phosphorus we need if business as usual in current farming and we don't improve our efficiencies. And as you can see, there's a massive shortfall. And this paper by Cordell suggests that improving agricultural efficiency is a massive way of helping us feed people and get this phosphorus we need for crops. And then as a final point, it's not equally distributed throughout the world, which can cause massive problems for food security. The EU doesn't have a very big long-term supply, so we're going to depend on importing it from other countries, which may become difficult or may not, depending on how the world looks by 2050. So we've looked at these nutrients, how they're used in fertilizers conventionally, and how there's a lot of waste. So we'll talk about hydroponics now, which is the main focus of this talk. So overall fertilizer usage in hydroponics is less than conventional agriculture. Fertilizer is usually in a closed system that recycles and recirculates through your plants. So there's very little spillage, there's very little runoff, it's all contained, it's not escaping into the environment. So we're using much less, but we still overuse it in hydroponics. So a lot of the nutrient solutions we produce and use incredibly high levels of nutrients in them, way more than the plants need. And this is usually so the plants are never limited. They have all the nutrients they'll ever need. They grow really high yields and quite big. This can lead to nutrient imbalances happening. I'll discuss how that happens in later slides. But because the solution contains more nutrients than the plants can use, our efficiencies tend to be quite low. So for nitrogen, for example, it can be as low as 14%. And I'll explain why that is and where the nitrogen can go. But this is mainly because if imbalances form in the solution and it becomes unusable and starts to affect yields, the nutrient solution is considered to be spent and can be purged. So you either replace all of your solution or you do a part dilution and then add fresh solutions to it to sort of hide any imbalances and make it more usable for your plants. And this is where we lose a lot of our nutrients. So we really need to understand these systems and what happens with the nutrients in hydroponic systems. I'm going to explain why it's important. So it's a really powerful analytical tool. You can identify trends in your farms. So if you're constantly monitoring your nutrient solution as well as your environment, so a lot of farms are constantly monitoring temperature, humidity, light, all these huge sources of large data and making incredibly powerful data sets. You can start spotting trends and seeing where the nutrient demands in your systems are, what growing cycles, are they different under different crops? And you can just get a lot of data that way, can really improve how you run your farm. All this data and your large data sets can also feed into sort of new developing tech that's quite cutting edge at the minute. So crop specific light recipes are a big thing, where you change the wavelength of light to either change the taste of your plants, the nutrient content, increasing yields. But as you're changing what the plants are made out of, and you're going to be changing the nutrients they require. So you might need to tailor your nutrient solutions to your light recipes, try and get the most bang for your buck. So all this data would feed back into that. And you can do some cool things with crop selection. So if you can see on this chart on the right, this is hydroponic system where they've grown tomato, basil and lettuce, and there's 4 nutrients in there. You can see the conductivity was kept the same. As you can see, just keeping the conductivity the same isn't enough. You're getting quite large swings in certain nutrients. So on the bottom left, you've got phosphorus, and in all 3 plants, it's behaving incredibly differently. So you do get these swings. What you could do in this situation, and it could help the crop selection, is you could choose a plant. So if it's you can see in the bottom 2, it's basil's using a lot of phosphorus and not much sulfur. You could pair that with a plant that you know uses a lot of sulfur and not much phosphorus, and just increase the efficiency. So all your nutrients are used at similar levels. They're not becoming out of balance. And then you've got multiple different crops that could potentially combine into one product. So say salad bowl, something like that. It's quite cool. If you know what your patterns and the nutrient dynamics are, you can start customizing your fertilizer to the crop to increase its efficiency. And if you're customizing your fertilizer and you're not getting imbalances, you don't have to purge any spent fertilizer from your system, so you're not dumping anything. So it's quite good. So we'll talk about fertilizers you get in hydroponic systems and why you'd select certain ones and why some might be better for improving your efficiencies as others. So there's two main types. There's a liquid fertilizer and a solid fertilizer. We'll talk about the liquid first. This is the solution most people tend to be familiar with. It's usually sold as a complete fertilizer, so just one part you dilute in water, or two parts, which I think most people are familiar with, an A and a B solution that you just dilute in water in your system. They're incredibly easy to use. Usually just hook the A and B solution directly up to pumps that slowly dose equal amounts into your system. Keep your nutrient levels and EC where you want them to be. It's incredibly simple and there's not much user error because it can be automated. You can buy pre-made mixes. So you can get a lettuce one, cucumber, pepper, tomato, quite variable and quite good. The downside is they're mostly water, so they're diluted stock solutions. And if you're buying them in large quantities, they can be quite expensive to ship. It's because you're shipping mostly water, it's a lot of weight. And if you're using large quantities, they can be quite difficult to store just because they're a liquid. And if you have any problems with leakage, or you break a pipe or a valve, you can have a big problem and a big spill on your hands. They're also quite difficult to customize just because they're pre-made, pre-mixed, and you can't really do much with them. But I'll discuss what you can later. Solid fertilizers is your other option. So compared to large shipments of liquid fertilizer, they're considerably cheaper. You're getting more bang for your buck. All you've got to do is add water. They're quite easy to store. Just in a cool, dry place away from heat sources and any oxidizers, and you should be okay. And they're usually bought in bulk, which can be a good side or a downside depending on your farm size. They're slightly more complex to dilute. They're not just in a liquid form you just add for water. You have to actually dilute different parts yourself, and the complexity is around how many parts they are. So they're usually multi-part fertilizers. You can get a pre-made, pre-mixed one. You just have to buy about a ton of that, so it's not suitable for all people. And then you can get multi-parts, either come in 3 parts or up to 11 parts, and you dilute them all yourself in different proportions. And this can cause user error if you're not comfortable with it. But I'll show you some tools you can use to make this process much easier and figure out how you can use solid fertilizers. As I say, you can get them in pre-made mixes. You can get tomato, pepper, cucumber mixes just like the liquid ones, but you can be a lot more variable because you can add your own nutrients to it, really customize them. Another great thing about solid mixes is they allow for doping of nutrients. So if you buy an 8-part mix and you notice your system is low on potassium, you can actually dope it with a specific potassium mix to increase the amount in there and stop imbalances happening. So I'll cover imbalances and dynamics and why they happen in your systems now. And that's mainly because electroconductivity measurement we use to measure how much nutrients are in our water and for nutrient solutions isn't incredibly accurate. It's a really ballpark figure. So it just tells you roughly how conductive the water is, and you infer what that means in sort of your nutrient levels. So when you first set up your system and you know exactly what's in there, it's great, EC is great. But as your plants grow, you start to acquire different nutrients at different growth stages, and they need them in different amounts, ratios, and proportions. So a vegetative growing stage, a fruiting growing stage, and a flowering growing stage will all need totally different requirements. Plants will be different sizes, and this really causes a large lot of variation. And if you are just using your EC and adding a set amount of nutrients with your nutrient solution and not varying them, these imbalances will get bigger over time. So as you can see in this bottom left graph, I showed you this before. This is 3 different types of plants grown in a hydroponic system. EC was kept constant. Every single day the EC was made the same with set nutrient solution, the way most people would use them. And you are getting these wild swings and imbalances happening. And over a large enough timeline, that starts to cause issues, and that's usually why we purge our solutions. Another issue that can cause these imbalances to develop is the source water we use. So depending on whether you're using tap water from the municipal supply that you've off-gassed all the chlorine from, or a borehole, if you're not filtering it, it's going to contain certain elements and minerals, usually sodium, calcium, magnesium, things like that. In my farm, we lose about 100 litres of water a day just to transpiration from the plants. So we have to constantly replace that. If we're not filtering the water, we're constantly doping the system with these nutrients that are in our source water, and they can be quite significant and they can cause huge imbalances. So source water on my farm, I have to filter because it contains quite a lot of sulfur. And if I have a litre of unprocessed tap water, it contains about 30% of the sulfur I'd want in my final solution. So I'm just adding that in. I'm just dumping tons of sulfur in each time, and that'll cause me imbalances. I'll notice my yields change, and I'll have to purge the solution. Another issue can be due to chemical and biological reactions happening that convert the nutrients into inaccessible forms. So on this graph on the bottom right, this is nutrient use efficiency of nitrogen, phosphorus in hydroponic system. Look at the top one, which is nitrogen. The black bars at the top are nutrients that are just lost from the system completely. They're not in the water, they're not in the plants, they're just gone. In nitrogen, I would assume this is mainly due to denitrification. So you're getting anoxic spots in your system where there's low oxygen for various reasons. Denitrifying bacteria being recruited from the environment, they'll always be recruited in, even if you sterilize your system, they come from the environment, they go where the nitrogen is, they turn the nitrates into nitrogen gas and it leaves your system and it's just gone. So that's more of a biological reaction. And then if you look at the phosphorus on the bottom of this bottom right graph, the smaller black bars, that's usually due to phosphorus reacting with other chemicals in your solution when they become unbalanced and forming a solid complex and just falling out of solution and being completely locked away from your plants. They'll never be able to access them again. And as you can see, you can look at the efficiencies in this graph as well, which is really important. The nitrogen in tomato, you have 25% efficiency, so 25% of the nitrogen you put in that system is coming out as plants. And then for lettuce, it's even lower, it's like 14%, which potentially abysmal. There's quite a lot of wastage going on there. And as I said, a lot of these imbalances usually come back to just purging the system, just dump it so it's not imbalanced, start afresh and start again. So now we know what fertilizers are used, we understand some dynamics that may be happening in our system, so we would want to monitor them. So I'll briefly go through how you could do that, sort of monitor your nutrient levels and figure out what's happening in your system and really get to grips with it and understand it. So I have quite a lot of time because I'm a PhD student, so my time's quite cheap, and I don't have a lot of money because I have a limited amount of spend on consumables. So I do it in-house, where it's usually cheaper. You can only really test your nutrient solution in-house. You can't really test your plants. I'll talk about that later. But because I like it quite cheap and I have a lot of time, I use this HANA instrument kit. So the one on the left, the multi-photometer, it'll test all 16 micronutrients, macro micronutrients I'm interested in. I can do this for about £10 per test. If you want to test less nutrients, it'd be even cheaper. So I use the HANA one. It's cheap, but it uses a lot of technician time. If cost isn't an option for you and your technician time is quite important, you can use the Hatch one. Slightly more expensive, so £38 a test. Do all 16 macro micronutrients. Like I say, if you want to test less, it'll be much cheaper. More of an upfront cost. The actual piece of kit costs around £3,000, but it's incredibly quick and easy to use. Your technician time is for about half an hour for those 16 nutrients, and that's mainly because if you look at the bottom right, you can see the vials. You get a vial, it's got the reagents already in it, and it has a little barcode on. You dilute your nutrient solution, decant it into the vial, give it a little shake, you put it into the spectrophotometer, it reads the barcode, and it does all the processing and analysis for you, and it just spits out a value, and it's incredibly quick, easy to use. It's not very cheap. Whereas for the HANA reagents one, if you look at the bottom left photo, you just get bulk bottles of reagents. You can mix everything yourself, and that's why it takes a little bit longer. If you want to use an external lab, just not waste any time doing it. Nutrient solution analysis, the cheapest I found it is around £30 from Natural Resource Management in York. Depending on how many samples you want and what you want to test, it's maybe cheaper for you. And then you can also test your plant tissue analysis. So once you have your nutrient solutions and you know what's going on, you can infer what's happening taken up by your plants. It's always good just to get confirmation, and that allows you to identify your nutrient use efficiency completely. That can range from about £30 to £40, depending on how much material you want to test. The less material you want to test, the more expensive it's going to be. You can just use offcuts or wasted parts of plants if you just want to send them off for a nutrient analysis. And once you have all this information, you can look at what your usage efficiency would be, and you can really understand what's happening when you're putting nutrients into your system, how they're reacting in the water, how they're going into the plants, and you can really understand what's happening. So once you understand your dynamics and you understand your fertilizer and everything that's happening, you start looking at customizing it. So if you are growing lettuce, for example, and zinc is becoming a big problem, you're losing a lot of zinc, you can change your nutrient solution you're using so it's higher in zinc. You can also just dope zinc into it, and this calculator helps you do this. So trying to reverse engineer a nutrient solution from an initial set of elements that you want. Those elements don't exist out in the real world. You have to get inorganic salts, which usually contain one or two of them. So if you wanted a source of nitrate, you have ammonium nitrate, potassium nitrate, calcium nitrate, and it's quite difficult to balance all of these in your head or making an Excel spreadsheet. So this custom calculator is the best thing I've ever used. It's the nutrient solution calculator by Dr. Luca Incrosi, I think. I'm probably butchering that Italian pronunciation, but it's really quick, simple to use, and it's an extremely powerful tool. So you input your nutrient source and what its nutrient content is. You could also input a spent solution, so what the initial conditions of your nutrient solution are that you want to change. So it would either input water that has some nutrients in, or a spent solution. You have your desired concentrations you want, you input that, what you'd like your nutrient solution to look like in terms of exact elemental breakdown, EC and pH. You can input the size of your farm, so how much water nutrient solution is currently in there, how big your stock tanks are, what you want your dilution ratios to look like. If you have a multi-part mix of fertilizers, you can put which organic salts you have in. If you don't have anything and you want it to suggest something to you, it'll give you a complete breakdown of what it thinks would be best to put into your system. And depending on what acids and bases you have access to for pH control, you can put those in as well, or it can suggest them. So you put all these parameters in, you hit go, and it gives you a really detailed report out. So this is a really simplified version I've put on the screen, but I put what my source water was, what I want my output to be. I said I didn't have any nutrients at all, and I wanted to suggest it to me. So you can see it's giving me a stock solution that's an A and a B. It tells me exactly how much of each I have to put in. It tells me the exact cost of using these nutrients. It gives me a cost per 1,000 litres of my nutrient solution. And it also tells me if I'm going to run into any issues, like am I going to have any precipitation because I'm using the wrong things, and it'll suggest corrections to me. It's fully customizable and it's extremely powerful. So it can be used to either make a brand new solution, totally custom to your crop, or if you want to find out how much you need to dope your spent solution with to make it reusable again, you can use this. It's really good. So looking back at everything we looked at, sort of understanding your dynamics, understanding your fertilizers, how you can change them and dope them, you can start looking at how you can improve the nutrient usage efficiency of your system. You can start to reduce the frequency and severity of your system purges. So if you're monitoring how your nutrients are changing over time, you can make informed decisions about when you need to purge some and dilute down your solution and make it back up to levels that the plants are happy with. So you can do that. So rather than just doing that every 2 weeks, as you might have done previously, you can actually look and be informed and say, actually, I need to do this every 3 weeks, every 5 weeks potentially, and you're purging less, you're losing less nutrients, you're being much more efficient. You can also change the severity, so you can make an informed decision on how much solution you need to replace, rather than just dumping half of it, because that's what you suggested from colleagues, or all of it, because you just want it to make it really simple and not have to deal with all this sort of stuff. So you can really make informed decisions and improve your efficiency. You can start looking at nutrient doping to equalize imbalances. So if you've got all this data, you can see where your imbalances are happening, you can see where the issues are, and you use the calculator, you can start looking at, do I need to add magnesium to my system to make it more reusable? Just, do I need to add zinc? Do I need to dilute some copper out? Various things like that. And this increases the lifespan of your solution massively. You're reducing your discharge, you're just sort of editing it as you go. And it's just working towards this minimal discharge system where you're not purging anything, you're increasing your efficiency, you're being much more green. And then another interesting thing is, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the nutrient solutions we currently use have way more nutrients than the plants need in them. And then when we have to purge them, we're just losing a lot, and it's really inefficient. Nutrient solutions can be weaker and produce similar results. So in this graph I'm showing you on the screen, there's the hydroponic measurements you saw in previous slides, but there's also aquaponics measurements. So in aquaponics, nutrients are from fish waste rather than in organic salts. They're usually at lower concentrations than in hydroponics, but you can get similar results. So basil and lettuce in this example, hydroponic systems outperformed aquaponics massively, hands down. It's like that's an issue for aquaponics, unfortunately. But if you look at tomatoes, the tomatoes were equal in both systems, even though aquaponic systems had less nutrients in. So we know it's possible to use less and get similar results. We just need to sort of understand it more. So that brings me to the conclusions. So as discussed, hydroponics uses considerably less fertilizer than traditional agriculture methods, but our use of fertilizer in these systems, even though we're using less, is still incredibly inefficient and can be improved. We can improve this with better understanding how we use nutrients in our systems. The dynamics are, because they're going to be different in every one, depending on what crops you grow and various variables. Once we understand these systems, it can help us make informed choices and how we go about improving efficiencies within them. So as I mentioned before, if there's a bacterial problem, how do we go about solving that? If the participation problems, we change the fertilizer to stop that from happening, or do we tailor fertilizers to crops? So monitoring and customizing things can really help increase the lifetime of our nutrient solutions and stop us purging them and just wasting them, greatly improving our efficiency. Also, as I mentioned before, nutrient dynamic data sets are really great tools for high quality R&D. So if you want to grow a new type of crop, or you're experimenting with different cultivars and the nutrient densities, just having this nutrient dynamic data would be quite interesting. It also helps with error catching. So one error I've seen is if you have an A and B solution for your hydroponic farm, and you've got little dosing pumps or peristaltic pumps, and you think they're dosing equal amounts that you need for a good nutrient mix for your plants. If one is slightly blocked and dosing less, over time there'll be a massive imbalance, and you won't know why it's happening if you're not measuring the nutrients and just catching these small errors. So really useful. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I'll be taking questions now. I've also put the URL to the nutrient solution calculator on this slide just because it's incredibly useful, and then a YouTube link to a little tutorial in 15 minutes how to use it. And that's everything. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Laurence. I'm sure everyone is clapping at the moment. That was really good. So yeah, everyone, if you want to ask questions, we've got a couple already, but if you want to ask those, go to the slido.com and the number 47813 that's in the chat. But I'm gonna use my host privilege and ask the first question.
Yep.
I'm quite interested, Laurence, in like in using like food waste or other byproducts to make sort of, you know, these nutrient teas that people talk about, and how sort of viable do you think that is in a commercial hydroponics industry? Is it never going to be quite right, or would you have to supplement so much anyway that it would be almost pointless, or is there an opportunity there maybe for actually quite a lot of business?
Yeah, so that's quite similar to what I'm researching. So I'm looking at aquaponics. So a lot of the nutrients in there are coming from organic sources. So as you say, nutrient teas, we have breakdown, there'll be a lot of like humic acids, and a lot of the nutrients are being sort of in organic form. And in aquaponics especially, like I said, the nutrient levels are quite low, which I assume would be sort of similar for some of these teas. So you can use that as a base if you want, base level of nutrients, and then you can dope it slightly to get levels that you want that are slightly higher and more suitable for your plants potentially.
Mm-hmm.
But because you're adding these initial amounts of organic nutrients in, the overall synthetic fertilizers, which I mentioned, are not particularly sustainable and massively energy intensive, are going to be reduced. So you're already making savings and helpings there. There are also maybe other benefits as well. So using organic nutrients, so aquaponics, I mentioned, it performed similarly to hydroponics in terms of tomatoes with lower nutrient levels. There's some debate about why that is. Some people think it's just the lower nutrient levels may be better for the plants in terms of transporters they use to take them up. It could be the organic molecules, organic acids, humic acids that are in them that help increase and promote plant growing. It could be that these organic nutrients recruit bacteria to the root zone and allow the natural bacteria you'd find in the environment and in soil and in plants, the mycorrhiza and things, be recruited to the roots and help them and make them more efficient at taking nutrients up that wouldn't happen in the sterile system. There's a lot of debate around it, and it might be better just to try it and use it. That would be my response.
That's yeah, that's quite interesting. Yeah, and I suppose could you, I guess connected with that, is there any scope for using some of the leftover hydroponic stuff to like go feed back into that organic mix that you may have got, or is there too much waste product in that?
In what, sorry? In
so
the,
I mean, if you know, when you're about to replenish your hydroponic solution, is there anything useful left in that?
Yeah. So what I was trying to convey in this is, because the plants only use a small proportion, so as you saw, about 14% of the nitrogen that is in a system for something like lettuce and hydroponic system, and we totally overuse the nutrients, there's still quite a high proportion left in there when we're spending it. So I would recommend trying to dope the system, so looking at where it's deficient and adding those nutrients back in yourself, just to bring everything back up to sort of equilibrium where you want it. So you could try, depending on how your solution's spent and what's missing, if your organic stuff is able to replace that, go for it, you can use it. If it doesn't quite match up, I'd suggest using something else. But that's why I think that calculator is quite a powerful tool, because you can put your spent solution in as your source water, and then you can put your nutrient tea in as a fertilizer mix, and you can see whether or not it overlap and what other things you might need to add just to use it and stop you dumping potentially thousands of litres depending on the size of your farm.
Great, thanks. Okay, the first question we have, I think you've already answered by posting the link, is the system you showed by Dr. Incroci available to get, but is that the link on the screen just now? Yeah, that's
the link. So Wageningen, the agricultural university in the Netherlands, are currently hosting it. So you just go on there, you can download it, and then there's the YouTube link. So if you just search nutrient system calculator and the guy's name comes up, and he does a brief 15-minute tutorial teaching you how to use it. It's incredibly simple and idiot proof, so you should get a lot of miles out of it.
Very nice. All right, next anonymous question. Are there platforms available that allow for comparison of this kind of data with other farm data?
Not that I've seen that's sort of public access. So a lot of my personal nutrient solution I use in my experiments, I've gotten through literature searches. So I have access to it through the university. I usually do a literature review to scour what people are using for, say, lettuce, because that's my speciality. And you tend to find different things that people tend to be using. Either commercial mixes local to them because they're easy to get hold of, they're either in academia and they're making their own, or using specific recipes that are used in academia just to standardize things. Or people just make their own and they go completely funky with it. So I compare these and look at sort of yields and things and figure out what'd be best. Then I run my system, take my samples, figure out where I need to modify the solution to make it run more efficiently. And I sort of have that data personally. You can get this data from a lot of the papers. If you're not part of the university, if you email the author, if it's behind a paywall, they're usually quite happy to just have their work disseminated and send it to you for free. And then a lot of the commercial operations, the big growers, tend to play their cards quite close to their chest and sort of keep the nutrient data for themselves, along with a lot of their other data, just because it's a bit of an industry secret. Hopefully that becomes sort of less frequent. People start to share the data and use more open source platforms, and we can all sort of massively accelerate our learning just from having these data sets out and in the open. Because once they're out and in the open, we can start plugging them into models. They become incredibly useful for generating data and experiments to try and improve things. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's something we're definitely interested in at UKUAT, but we still have to balance that with the sort of sensitivity and protecting the know-how of what our members and everyone that actually wants to. There's a balance there. But, thanks for that.
No worries.
So I've got a question here. Can we create circular systems from outputs? For example, when we have to purge, putting it into growing algae for another application.
Yeah, I'd say that that's totally possible. So I know a lot of dairy farms, they have a lot of liquid waste, so whey, that's quite high in waste nutrients that they just put into pools, and they're growing duckweed and other forms of algae and microalgae that can be used as a feed source for the cows once again. So I don't see why it wouldn't be an issue with sort of spending nutrient solution, especially seeing as I'm sure you're all aware, algae just likes to grow in anything it can and it'll recruit itself. So I have spoken to different people that use algae as an amelioration tool. So they use it to process waste, like I said, dairy waste before discharging it. They use different types of algae, so like red algae, green algae, just to try and reduce it all. And that's mainly used as an ameliorant, just to strip it out. And then they don't really do much with the algae. But if you've got specific ones that you know are good at purging certain nutrients, there's no reason you couldn't grow it. And if it's a commercial algae that you can sell afterwards, that's great. But I think there's definitely an option on the cards.
Great. Yeah, I'm aware of a few projects. Names aren't coming to mind right now, but yeah, yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Okay. In terms of nutrient availability for plants in aquaponics, is there a species of fish that provides a more balanced amount of nutrients than others?
Yes. Okay. So this is a very interesting question. So most aquaponic systems tend to be coupled systems. So that means the fish component and the hydroponic component are connected. So water goes from the fish to the hydroponics and then back. Obviously, doing this, you have two completely different species from different branches of the tree of life that want different things. So there can be a bit of competition there. So plants want quite high nutrient loading, the fish want quite low nutrient loading just because a lot of the nitrates they produce are toxic for them. The fish want a low pH, around about 5.5 to 6. The fish want a higher pH, around 7. So if you're running a coupled system, you have to make some trade-offs, and a lot of people use tilapia, mainly because it's an incredibly hardy fish that's can take a lot of abuse. It can live in incredibly high nutrient water quite happily in high densities. So that's the main fish for coupled system. It doesn't produce nutrients in correct levels to grow your plants properly, and you can't really dope them to the required levels just because you start to damage the fish. So the entire sort of industry is looking towards decoupled systems where you grow fish separately from plants, and then any wastewater you would purge from your recirculating fish system, you add into your plant system, and just to replace transpired water, nutrients. You take your nutrient readings in that system, and then you dope it up to levels the plants are much more happier with, so you can lower the pH because the fish aren't getting any of that water back. It's just when they transpire out the plants. They get the nutrient levels they want, which are slightly higher. They get the pH they want, and they just get the conditions they want, and they're much happier. And it seems to increase sort of yield and productivity, and you're still using waste from your fish farm and stopping that going out into rivers and things. So with that, you can use different fish or combinations of fish that produce waste that's complementary to each other, that can sort of get a more balanced mix for your plants doing it that way. So I hope that answers the question.
I think that's quite a comprehensive answer. Thank you. Right, we've got 2 more questions on the list. Well, yep. So there might be time for one more if anybody wants to add that in. But, so this question is, are there any specific nutrients or minerals we should be monitoring or adding solely for the benefit of the microbiological synergists or symbiotes?
Yeah, okay. So I don't know that off the top of my head. It's a bit out of my wheelhouse. What I do know, especially in the aquaponic field, they're quite heavily looking into not running sterile systems like they do in hydroponics. They want to look at having bacteria in there because they think it may help with the root zone and uptake, nutrient uptake in plants. They also think if you've got a layer of either neutral bacteria or beneficial bacteria all over your system, it outcompetes any pathogens that may be introduced and stops them getting a foothold. Whereas in hydroponics, you have to be very careful of that, just because you have a very nutrient-rich solution and a complete vacuum of biological materials. So that's why we have really high sterilization protocols and really high water quality standards. But in aquaponics, they're looking at what bacteria are in there and what benefits they may be. So there's 3 PhDs I know that will be finishing their research in the next year that are in Wageningen. The Netherlands, they're looking at what bacteria are recruited, how they change over time. So especially with fish waste, a lot of organic material is entered into the system and the levels rise. As the organic material is broken down at different rates, so plants use nutrients at different rates, and you're having all these fluxes and dynamics, the bacterial compositions will change. So they're looking at mapping the entire biome, microbiome in an aquaponic system. And once they've done that, they'll be able to identify what the nutrient requirements for the bacteria are, what nutrient requirements recruit different bacteria, and how beneficial they'll be. So I think a lot of that data would be able to be directly transposed into hydroponics if we wanted to run non-sterile systems and run them with bacteria in that could potentially stop pathogens, or plant and human pathogens both entering the system and getting a foothold. And sort of increasing the sort of the ecosystem and resilience overall in there. So I don't have an answer for you yet, but hopefully in a year or 2 they'll publish and that data will be out there.
Mm. So yeah, I suppose what you're saying is that, well, the hydroponics is always kind of leaned towards this very sterile environment, but aquaponics can't do that by its nature. And it may be the case that as we see some benefits from the aquaponic process, maybe hydroponic systems will maybe start to lean more back towards the slightly less sterile, slightly more natural style.
Yeah, exactly.
But they might not.
They might not. It might not. It depends. We'll see how the industry changes over the years. But yeah.
Cool. Cool. All right. Well, the last question I have here is a question about sensors, which I'm very interested in as well. So the question is, where are we at with specific single ion sensors for monitoring nutrient levels? Okay.
So I asked this question when I started my PhD because I thought, hey, they must exist. They'd be quite useful. They do exist for certain things, so like ammonia and some of the the nitrogenous compounds, they do exist, and they're used in a lot of wastewater management. The main issue is they're usually quite expensive, and they're quite prone to sort of fouling. So they need to be like maintained, cleaned, and replaced quite a lot. Because they were so expensive and so difficult to use, I sort of shied away from them. I spoke to Centre City in Liverpool, which help. You give them a problem, you tell them what sort of sensors you need, how you need them all to work together, and they can give you suggestions on what to use. And they just kind of said to me, like, the wastewater industry is looking at it. It's going to be too difficult for you as a PhD student to do. So I've shied away. They do exist. You can find them. I don't know how useful they'll be. So that's why I use the spectrophotometers, just because in half an hour you can have results. If you want to like spend 40 quid, if you want to spend £10 per sample, you can do it in 2 hours and have immediate results. And once you've got a couple of grow cycles in, you can determine what the fluxes in your system are. They tend to be quite regular because your plant growth is quite regular, and you can sort of reduce the frequency of testing. So you have no idea, you probably test every day, or every other day, or every few days, and then you probably test every week and then every month when you've got on top of it. So the spectrophotometers are quite good for the time being. They're quite cheap, especially compared to some of these big expensive sensors, but they aren't there for a lot of them. So a lot of the micronutrient ones, they aren't. They're just for the macronutrients, maybe mainly the nitrogenous stuff. But if you want to find them, look at the wastewater industry. That would be my advice.
Okay, so that's the best point of reference, is investigate what they're using in wastewater, probably.
Yeah,
they're at the cutting edge, probably. Would you say?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Cool. That's interesting. Yeah, because something I think about quite a lot. It seems to me that it's like ion selective membranes. Is that how most of these work? And then maybe just like an EC sensor behind an ion selective membrane, or is it?
Potentially. Some of the ones I looked at used sort of lasers and all sorts of things, and it was looking at, yeah, they were just really complicated. They might be able to make simpler ones, like you say. I just don't know if they exist.
Yeah. Or maybe that you just need some kind of inline, like reagent-based thing, like what you're using.
Yeah.
They somehow do it in line, but then you have all these difficulties with moving liquids around and calibration and stuff.
Yeah. Like I say, if you just take samples every day and freeze them, you can just go through your freezer, pick out ones you want, and just batch sample them, and in an afternoon you'll have data for the past month.
That's good. So you don't find yourself needing them so regularly that you'd want it to be much faster? No,
so I need quite high resolution data, so I'm sampling my water every day.
Yeah.
That's just so I can get really detailed data for any papers I want to publish. Like I say, if you're growing monoculture, or you've got a very select crop output that you're growing all the time, and you've got in the system, so if you have adults and juveniles in the system all the time and you're rotating them through, your nutrient demand should be the same at all times, because you've got sort of the same biomass at the same stages in there. So you can start to predict when you're going to need to purge, or when you might need to dope certain things, and it's quite cyclical. So the amount of testing you'd need to do would drop off as you understand your system more and more. And they'd just be the sense checks every now and then, just to make sure you know what you're doing. You can just sort of go off previous data and you got really.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. I think many of our nutrient questions we were too afraid to ask have been answered. And maybe we'll all think of many more over the next few weeks, and you can come back and answer more of them. But
yeah, no worries. My emails are there. My one with Farmer and my university one. Don't hesitate to send me an email if you got a question, and I'll answer it as best I can. Thank you for having me, guys. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, you're very welcome, and thank you everybody for attending. Keep your eyes peeled for more events at UKUAT.org, and see you next time.